All right, so I'm going to pass the microphone over to Tom and Pablo. Tom, take it away.
All right, unmuted. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Ken. I mentioned in the opening comments, I'm not sure everybody who's online was on in the first few minutes, but I'm Tom Lowe, the director of the robotics program at SRI International, where I've been now for about 35 years. SRI is a Silicon Valley non-for-profit research institute, been around for 73 years there, and credited with the invention of many of our technologies we use every day, like the ARPANET or Internet Now, and of course Siri for the iPhone, and of course the birthplace of intuitive surgical. SRI has been collaborating with Ken and other researchers, Michael Yip and Sanjay Krishna in Chicago, developing techniques for addressing latency and bandwidth that have thus far made the realization of far long distance telesurgery science fiction. But we're still very, very interested in kind of coming back to our roots. This is where all of the telesurgery work began, was with the concept of putting robots far forward in very otherwise difficult locations like the battlefield or very remote regions on the earth. So our present work in surgical robotics continues to focus on telesurgery with small, portable, minimalist systems. So over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking with Pablo Garcia. I've known Pablo since he was a grad student at Stanford and have the pleasure of working with him for about 20 years when he was a researcher at SRI. Pablo is now the Vice President of Research and Technology at Verb Surgical. And Pablo, if you wouldn't mind describing the path that you followed as a researcher at SRI and how it led you to your present position at Verb.
Oh, absolutely. So thanks everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I graduated from Stanford. Actually, I remember when I met Tom, he was showing me a robot that was crawling through some pipes to do some inspection. And when I joined SRI, that was in 1996, actually, when Gary and his team were just spinning off Intuitive. I ended up inheriting some of the programs of surgical robotics at SRI. We did a big program with DARPA TraumaPod, which was intended to demonstrate what it could be to automate processes in the OR, and to have as few people as possible in the OR would be very relevant in this environment. Then, over the years, we did many projects in robotics, not only in surgery, but also, humanoids and arms and hands and stuff like that. Eventually, we engaged with J&J on a project to develop a next generation surgical robotics, and that became Verb Surgical in 2015. And I've been at Verb Surgical since then, and continue to push the area of research and technology development.
Great, thank you very much. So probably in the research community, especially if in academics or a place like SRI, we can be very, very forward thinking. But sometimes our innovations are so forward looking that they'll never reach the market because of other barriers, whether it's just the market isn't ready for them or regulatory agencies aren't ready. So there are so many open problems in robotic surgery and healthcare care. I guess the question is, where should we as researchers in this field be focusing our energy to make a real impact?
Yeah, I think there's no easy answer to that, but I will go back to echo some of the comments that Gary was making. At SRI they always taught us to start with the needs, and no matter how difficult or how easy it is, you can't really go wrong. And the needs right now in surgery is again just the outcomes are just not good, at least compared to many other fields. There's high variability, and a lot of times there's just not a lot of knowledge of why outcomes are bad. So that's an area in which there's many different solutions that you can propose, but you can't really go wrong in terms of focusing the solutions on how to solve those problems.
Okay, and the needs as you're seeing them in the industry today, similar to what Gary was saying.
Yeah, so I think surgery, it's a really interesting field for me because it's still a bit of an art, and somebody talked about surgery as being an iceberg, where the tip of the iceberg is in textbooks, and most of the iceberg is underneath in the brain of a surgeon, and so that's why it's hard to teach and communicate. It takes many procedures to become proficient at a specific surgical technique. And sometimes, when people finish their residency, they start doing surgery. They don't really have anybody that is mentoring them. So they might, discover great things of doing things, or they might just go the wrong way and never realize that they keep on doing the wrong thing. We've been doing a lot of analysis of techniques around the world for various procedures, and sometimes you get somebody who has a great reputation. They're considered a very good surgeon, and you start looking into the details of what they're doing and realize that some of the mistakes they're making mistakes, and they're mistakes that are known by other people. It's just nobody's really looking at that level of detail. A lot of these folks, if people like that would benefit from having systems analyze their procedures and looking them into much higher level of granularity, and comparing them to sort of what should be the best practices. Imagine all the people that are on the learning curve, how they could benefit. So I really think that addressing surgical variability around the world and developing tools to look at technique in a much higher level of granularity in a way that machines can, but humans just don't have the, don't have the scale unless you have somebody really looking over your shoulder constantly, which is not practical. That's where I think a lot of the big opportunity lies.
All right, so again, it's helping the surgeon better understand both what best practices are and giving them the perception enhancement to allow them to make the right decisions, as opposed to a better set of tools, a better robot. And there's tools involved in the visualization and the contrast enhanced viewing and things like that. But it's really information technology we're talking.
Yeah, I mean, there's broadly speaking, there's three areas. One is the tools that interact with tissue, and the need is still there to access parts of the body that are difficult to access. Access them with in a minimally with a minimal collateral damage as possible. Having as much flexibility to reach the anatomy that you're targeting, that's still there. But the second area is really getting better perception. A lot of times the art of surgery is not really the doing. It's like any sport, sensing is a lot more important than actually doing. So when a pianist plays a really good piano player, it's not really they're playing, it's just how they're listening to music. If somebody throws or catches a football, it's not their hands, it's really their brain that is working and giving them information, making better predictions than others if they're a better player. So surgery is a bit the same thing, where the people that are able to visualize in their head what's coming next, that are able to synthesize all their experience in a way that is projected in making the decisions that they're making for the little decisions and the big decisions they're doing during the surgical procedure, are the ones that are better surgeons. So that's kind of perception, and there's two components to that. One is obviously sensing. So the more sensors you provide, obviously the more information that is explicit, and then how you interpret it. So both systems that give you sensors, whether it's visual sensors or tactile sensors or smoke spectroscopy sensors, or you name it, coupled with the interpretation of how those sensors are guiding some of the important decisions that you're making when you're doing dissection or reconstruction, is the second key area. And then the third area is really, your judgment. You know, how are you making decisions? How are you modeling the surgery? How are you projecting it in your brain? You know, those are the three broad areas. But I would say, you know, the area where there's a lot of research to be done is in the second and the third area. So sensing, perception, and judgment.
Well, you know, AI, and in particular the explainability of AI, is always a challenge when it comes to, for example, regulatory agencies. And I'm curious, as academics or as research-focused folks, what are the challenges and the barriers that do we face with companies like Verb in implementing what is maybe possible, but is going to be unfamiliar to the regulatory folks, and be pushing the boundaries a little too far in terms of the tech when it comes to provability?
No, that's a great point. You know, a lot of times, you know, when you develop complex algorithms, actually proving that they're safe is really the main thing. It's not so much that they're wrong, is if they're wrong, but it's safe, it's okay. But if it's wrong but it's not safe, then you know, that's a big issue. I think, you know, this is sort of breaking the problem apart. First is identifying where those algorithms can make a difference, and then also developing the tools to provide more transparency. I mean, that's a huge area of research in AI, the explainability of the models. It's definitely a big challenge. I think the one thing in surgery, though, is that, you know, this we always start with a post-operative analysis, right? That's a safe environment in which you can develop a lot of tools for learning and training, which actually have an immediate impact in improving, you know, the surgical techniques. Once those are proven in those environments, you can, you know, a subset of the ones that prove safe, you can start, you know, thinking of putting them in preoperative and then intraoperative solutions. But what you're pointing out is definitely a big filter. From all the things that you can do post-operatively, only a few will make it intraoperatively, because it's you know, it's a high bar to ensure that they're safe.
Yep. Yeah. Well, the other night we were chatting, and you talked about fusing data from multiple sources, and I think you used multispectral imaging as an example of how information from multiple sensors taken in together provide better answers potentially than any one particular sensor could. You'd have a lot of uncertainty around one sensor, and you suggested that reducing the output of each sensor to a human understandable form was perhaps throwing information away that may, if retained, be where the real nugget is. But then that when it comes to explainability, if you just take all the data and throw it in a big black box and mix it up and your algorithm has the answer, but no element of that is understandable, I see that as representing another huge challenge. It might be the right solution to the problem because it does provide the right answer all the time, even. Hard to prove that, but if one can't explain how it works, it creates a real challenge to getting it approved.
Yeah, definitely. So the answer to that in many of those cases is having enough data to prove that, you know, statistically the chances of getting it wrong is low. Yeah. So, you know, in the cases where you can't really explain the, you know, why it works, just being able to prove it through statistics is, you know, sort of the best. And, you know, there's no, I mean, we do that all the time in risk assessment, right? I mean, we say, well, this can go wrong, this can go wrong. And then, you know, what's the probability of things failing? And the best data you have for that is just empirical data. It's like, well, for so many hours of operation, you have these types of failures and you start putting probabilities together. But you kind of have to, you know, there's definitely a field here to be developed in terms of, you know, risk assessment for some of these algorithms. And like I said, I think if you have enough data, you can kind of do that assessment. And the probability is never going to be zero because, there's always a possibility of coming up with an edge case that you haven't considered.
Yeah.
But, whether it's on this or on self-driving cars, it's kind of an inherent problem that we're faced with, that we have to deal with. If we want to deploy, at some point, the cost benefit just becomes greater than the risk, right?
Yeah. Well, so a lot of these tools that we've talked about that involve augmenting the surgeon's perception and eventually improving their judgment have sort of it as an underlying foundation certain capabilities like soft tissue tracking, feature identification, semantic understanding of the scene. Are there opportunities specifically that folks like us in academia or in the research community should be addressing? Even if they don't solve the big problem, they're a foundational building block to enable the kind of vision that you're expressing?
Yeah, so I would say definitely in sensing is one big area, whether it's sensing by direct contact or sensing with no contact issues. I mean, no contact methods such as light or ultrasound or combination of introducing energy and seeing the reaction. The modeling of tissue and tracking in real time is definitely also a very big area of research that I can start obviously in the simplest cases with organs that don't move, organs that are solid organs that have limited movement, and then organs that have a lot of possible movement. So in the first category, obviously, we have the brain, and then the second category would be like kidney, liver, pancreas. Third category would be, being able to track tumors like in the colon or something that is, or the stomach, right, in the gastric, or the lung, for example, where things, deflate. So there's those are all big areas of opportunities. I think the other thing too that is really important is a lot of these the techniques. They can be done, like tracking of tissue and fusion of images and so on, but with a big impact on the workflow. And so developing techniques that are much more robust in terms of being able to integrate them with a workflow, so they don't require a big tracking system and calibrating it. They can be done on the fly. They can be done with 3D cameras. They can be, you can use multiple sources of information to fuse the images in a way that now it becomes practical during the surgical procedure. So you don't, have a special setup. That's also a big area that is interesting, for research.
Cool. What about user interface and its design? You think there's room for innovation around better presentation of information to the surgeon and to the surgical staff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it in an OR, it's for example, just placing cameras on displays and interacting with them. It's pretty primitive right now. Obviously, we have the laparoscopic camera for laparoscopic procedures, but there's also relevant information from panoramic cameras, but those are set. You can't really control them that well. Using big displays to convey information to the team or the surgeon that is doing the surgical procedure. That's a pretty intrusive way of conveying information. They take a lot of space. They're addressing everybody with with the same information, etc. So cameras that are more flexible, head-mounted displays that allow everybody to see the information that is pertinent to them, that allow them to align the information they have with the anatomy in a way that you have more proprioception. Allowing to interact with the having the environment be aware of where everybody is, what their gestures is, interacting with gestures. there's definitely a big opportunity for redesigning the OR in a way that is a lot more suited to the tasks that are being done and the way that people are doing those tasks.
Mhm. So you mentioned things like 3D head-worn displays, technologies like the Oculus Rift, or maybe higher-end professional alternatives that are now appearing on the market. Do you see those types of displays someday becoming dominant in the OR?
Yeah, I think so. Just because it's very convenient to have the display mounted to your head and not have. Right now in ORs they have huge booms just supporting displays, and that's a huge logistics and infrastructure project.
Yeah.
So having displays that follow you around and displays in which you can align the anatomy with what you're seeing is definitely an open issue. The problem is a lot of those displays right now, they're being done for the consumer industry. And so we can't really use them as is because the quality of the images is not great. So, if you're talking about the HoloLens, it's a consumer product, right? If you're talking about any other head-mounted display, typically they target wide fields of view, low quality, low cost. But there's no question that there is a need that is open for those.
Well, what we've done in the past with consoles like the Da Vinci, where you have essentially a fixed viewpoint, you can move the camera around, but it's somewhat isolating, right? You're pretty much not in the OR anymore. You're in this other world. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if the opportunity with head-mounted displays to change your view direction, naturally, look around and see much more information, keeping you more aware situationally of what's going on around you, as opposed to being so focused on the surgical field, if there's opportunities there.
Yeah, no, I think there is. And also, a lot of the work on the OR is providing context. So the more context you can provide, the more the team is aware of what the surgeon is doing, the more the surgeon of what the team is doing. The more choreographed and the smoother the surgical procedure goes. It really, when you see high performance teams operating, it's like a really smooth flow. And a lot of this is because they're really in sync. So user interfaces that allow people to be in sync, or making more explicit what is that the other person is looking at or thinking or planning on as a next step, can really bring that experience of flow that is right now the territory of only a few high performance teams, and make it more available to everybody else.
What you're telling me reminds me of the trauma pod, and it would be great if you could spend a couple minutes describing how that system worked, because it flowed so beautifully that our program managers thought we had rigged the demo somehow. I mean, it was that good. But a word or two about trauma pod and what our goal was and how it worked.
Yeah, so this was a system that we built with the intent of at least showing, it wasn't showing what's practical, it was showing what's possible. And the vision was, could you do an operation with no humans in the OR except for the patient, obviously. And so we set up all, this was a project we did with Gary and, Chris Hasser, the folks at Intuitive. So we have the Intuitive robot being basically served by other robots that change the tools and provided supplies and so on. And so the surgeon would sit on the console and would say, okay, well, now give me a suture, 22, and all these robots would start just getting busy around and then offer the suture and now change the tool, and then it would queue up and
voice integrated, right?
Yeah.
Voice activated, gesture tracking. It was.
But the thing that was interesting for me from an experience standpoint is that, when surgeons sat and they gave a command and they saw everything working the way they expected in the background, it just was like an emotional reaction that I think is the same type of reaction you get from a surgeon when the team is working really well and is doing as expected.
Yeah.
And the opposite, is frustrating when it's not.
Yeah.
So So anyway, just capturing that flow and that experience and making it not necessarily in the form of robots. In some cases yes, in some cases no, but making it available to surgeons, I think would be a huge plus.
Right. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, Pablo. Just one last question, I guess. Right now, there's a few robotic cases that have very, very deep market penetration. I mean, prostatectomies, hysterectomies, things that Intuitive Surgical has really pioneered. Yet the number of surgeries that are done robotically is still a very, very small proportion of all total minimally invasive surgeries. What about from an academic perspective, exploring procedures that really have not yet been attempted robotically? Clearly, there's some that just make no sense, but do you think there's a lot of opportunity in that white space, the unaddressed robotic surgery market?
Yeah, no, I think there is. I would say that there's from a couple directions. One is, I would continue to look at the fundamentals of each procedure to see if there's better ways of doing things, right? So because, in an abstract way, you're basically accessing anatomy, you're dissecting it, you're reconstructing. And in many cases, there's just ways in which it makes more sense to do it less invasively and more precisely. So that's kind of one area. But the second area is, part of the reason that the robot is in many cases it's low penetration. I mean, there's many reasons, obviously, but one of them is the workflow. You want a system that that doesn't have an impact on the workflow, or that improves the workflow, and that's a tall order, because when you have a surgeon helping you in a procedure, if you tell them to be there at 9 o'clock, they take care of everything, and then they're just ready to do the task. With a robot, there's a lot of babysitting that needs to be done. So technologies that require less babysitting, that integrate better in the workflow in a way that don't need to be maintained or taken care of by the team, also make a lot of sense. And from a robotic standpoint, that's a big area in which there can be a lot of work done.
Very good. Well, Pablo, I want to thank you very much for your time and for communicating so clearly to the audience what these unmet challenges are.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Always. Andrea?
Yes, thank you so much. I've learned so much, and the questions are just humming along. I'm hoping that all of our speakers will get a chance to look at the questions, even if we don't get to the audience, even if we don't get to everybody's question live, it's still very important to us, and we're going to be taking note of them and trying to answer them while we're throughout the session.